Welcome to the fifth episode of History Bites in 2022. My name is Dawn Owen, and I am the curator at Guelph Museums. History Bites is a 1 hour long casual conversation during which we talk about the latest news, exhibitions, and other happenings at Guelph Museums. Today I'm in conversation with contemporary artists Anong Migwans Beam, Anique Jordan, Barbara Todd, and Lynn Westfall. We are considering themes of war and human conflict in art making, drawing on the exhibition called Witnessing War, which is on view at Guelph Museums from April 30th to December 4th, 2022. History Bites airs on Facebook Live at noon on the third Wednesday of every month. A recording of today's History Bites will be available through the Museum Everywhere portal, on our website, and on our socials after the broadcast. I am recording today's program in Guelph, Ontario. Before I formally introduce and welcome our guests, I'd like to acknowledge the land and its history, as well as our present-day land relationships. Guelph is located on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabe peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The place we now call Guelph is on land that is described in the Between the Lakes Purchase, Number 3 Treaty of 1792, an agreement between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the British Crown concerning over 3 million acres of land between Lakes Ontario, Huron, and Erie. When we gather, we spend time in conversation about the land, its history, and its peoples. We continue to grow our knowledge and our relationships with our treaty partner, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and with the many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who call Guelph home. This informs all that we do at the museum and underscores our commitment to each other today and for the health and well-being of future generations. Today's conversation centers on the exhibition titled Witnessing War and poses the question, is art a salve to war? The exhibition is inspired by the First World War doctor, soldier, and poet Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, who is remembered for his wartime poem In Flanders Fields, which he wrote from the trenches near Ypres, Belgium, around the 3rd of May, 1915. Although the poet McCrae is often celebrated, this exhibition takes a closer look at his graphite and ink drawings. Informed by McCrae's creative expressions, Witnessing War features works by local and national artists, spanning 100 years of art in the face of war. The exhibition includes works made in response to the 6 global conflicts in which Canada has fought, and also considers works by local artists and national artists who pictorialize, explore, and return to the themes of human conflict in their work. And in joining me today are Anong Migwans Beam, Anique Jordan, Barbara Todd, and Lynn Westfall, all of whom have either work in the exhibition itself, and then in case of Anong, she's here to share with us some thoughts and ideas about her father, Carl Beam's work, which is included in the exhibition. So I'm very delighted at this point to offer some biographical information by way of introduction to each of our guests today. And I'll start with Anong. Anong is a painter, a mother, a paint maker, and a curator who lives and works in our home community of Michigan First Nation on Manitoulin Island. Raised by her artist parents Carl Beam and Anne Beam, Anong was taught from a young age how to harvest hematite pigment in the La Cloche mountain range near their home. Anong's company, Beam Paints, is the result of a multi-generational love of pigment, paint, color, and innovation. And I am excited to have another conversation with you, Anong, about exactly that. It's just so interesting what you're doing in terms of paint making. But please welcome. I'm so delighted to have you as part of today's conversation.
Oh, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'd also like to introduce Anique. Anique Jordan is an artist, award-winning writer, educator, curator, and entrepreneur. In her recent work, Anique considers working class aesthetics, time travel, invisibility, Caribbean carnival, and Black Canadian futurities. She is part of the curatorial team at the Art Gallery of Ontario and is the executive director of Whippersnapper Gallery. I need to know more about Whippersnapper Gallery in another conversation, I promise you, Anique. I love these moments for us to come together in these ways. But welcome to History Bites. I'm delighted to chat with you today.
I'm happy to be here, but I think that bio is very old.
Oh,
I'm so sorry from probably 2017 because I'm definitely neither of those things right now.
no. Oh, well, do you have a moment to share some of what you're currently
Um,
doing?
I'm currently in school. I'm working on my MFA. I worked as a guest curator for a show at the AGO in 2017, I would say, and same with Whippersnapper Gallery. I was the director there for a few years.
Well, I'm so excited that you're doing your master's, and I definitely promise you then we need another conversation so we can catch up on what you've been doing since 2017. But I'm delighted
Absolutely.
that you've joined us today. Thanks so
Yes,
much,
thank
Annie.
you for having me.
And over to Barbara Todd. Barbara was born in Galt, Ontario, so not too far from where Lynn and I are in Guelph this morning. Barbara studied art and art history at the University of Guelph in 18, excuse me, 1981. Golly. In 1981, she moved to Banff, Alberta, where she lived and worked at the Banff Centre for the Arts. Her security blanket and coffin quilt series, begun in Banff, have been exhibited widely. One of the security blanket pieces is actually on view in this exhibition. So it'll be interesting to hear more from Barbara about that piece. Barbara, you moved to Montreal in 1993. Your acclaimed Jardin de Garasol Healing Garden from 2008 is a 34-meter long public artwork in light, color, and glass. You taught at the Fiber and Material Practices area of Concordia University and weaving at Emma Willard School in Troy, New York. In 2017, Barbara was commissioned to create a permanent public artwork for the St. Patrick's subway station of the TTC. And that is, I guess we have a date to come for that installation.
I hope I'm alive.
Oh, golly, I hope you are too. Especially having been born in the 1800s, as I tried to suggest. Oh my golly. So Barbara, you typically reside in Troy, but you're chatting with us today from Calgary.
Yes,
Welcome
we're
to the show.
visiting visiting friends and family for the first time since COVID. And my mother-in-law, who is 92, lives in Calgary.
Wonderful. Well, I'm sure that you've only just arrived there and you've taken the first part of your day to join us in this conversation. So I'm so pleased and delighted that you're here. And then I will also introduce Lynn Westfall. So Lynn is a Guelph artist born in Windsor, Ontario, and raised in Sarnia and Point Edward. Lynn entered the Religious Order of the Sisters of St. Joseph in London, Ontario. During that time, she taught primary children and studied fine arts at the University of Windsor. Lynn then became a visual artist, a visual arts high school teacher, and focused on her painting career. In 2011 and 2013, Lynn studied at the British Institute of Florence in Italy. She's now retired from teaching, but Lynn continues to paint in her studio at Boarding House Arts here in Guelph. Welcome, Lynn.
Oh, thank you.
Welcome.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. Well, and truly my pleasure to have all to share time and space with all of you, even if we must do it virtually. But I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm interested and curious to hold the space, create this platform in order for us to share our thoughts and ideas. I'd like to share with you and our listeners a quote by Laura Brandon, who has written extensively about war art in Canada. And this quote also appears sort of writ large in the exhibition space within Witnessing War. And I'll read it here. The record proves that we prefer to avoid depicting the darker side of our history in favor of ritualized mourning and remembrance. We reduce the dead to poppies and other symbols. When I read that quote, it struck me in a host of ways. Not least of which is the fact that Guelph Civic Museum, Guelph Museums, is charged with the responsibility to interpret the Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae story, the writing of In Flanders Fields, the symbolism of the poppy in the context of remembrance. And so when I read this quote, I thought long and hard about what it means for us in the context of this exhibition, in the work we're doing as a museum, in the work we do with each other and as community. And so thought I would sort of plant that quotation with each of you this morning as well. So my first question is really meant for everybody assembled here today. I'm interested in how you think about art in the context of war, and I've phrased the question this way: is art a salve to war? Who would like to start us off in terms of trying to answer that question?
Well, what I did, Dawn, was look up the word salve, S-A-L-V-E, in the dictionary and tried to get it. What does this really mean? And I got the Oxford says it's a healing, an application to wounds, a soothing over. And salvare in Latin says to be well. And, going back to this idea of avoiding, um, I don't think a wound is a wound. And the deeper it is, the more real it is. And so we cannot avoid facing this. And I know in my practice, I want to help people do that. And so I'm not sure that it really soothes things over. And should we even try to soothe it over?
That's a really interesting question. I did the same too when I was wrestling with the language, with the
Mhm.
terminology of salve. It is interesting to me the the idea of healing in art, and I wonder if that healing is something that happens through the process of art making, and or does it also happen sort of when the viewer engages or receives or experiences the artwork itself. And sort of to take the counter view, if it really isn't about healing, if the answer to that question is, in fact, no, art is not a salve to war, I wonder what art is in the context of war then.
Mm, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know if I have a response to the possibilities of art. It's something that I'm thinking about all the time, and the perhaps the responsibilities or the the work of the artist, the role of the artist within the community. When I think about war and I think about the trauma that comes from war and I think about the irrationality behind engaging in acts of war, I I wonder if, similar to what Lynn is saying, if it's possible to have a salve, if that even is, if that's can be congruent with something that is so irrational and so painful. I think that there perhaps is a space for us to think about art differently, for us to think about spaces that are less like art practices that are perhaps even less material, that are based in acts of care, that are spaces, physical spaces created. Um, uh, I feel sometimes I think of those spaces as like we talk about them sometimes in the context of being art practices, but I also wonder, like, when we think of them sort of as these like day-to-day practices or ways that we can engage with community that ends up being coded as art, but really is about like caring practices of care. To me, those sort of languages and that sort of space that maybe removes sort of a contemporary understanding of what art can look like and puts it into day-to-day acts of like showing up, being in relationship with, caring for each other. Those sort of acts for me kind of approximate a space to begin answering that question, but I don't have an answer to it, and I don't know if there is, or if art needs to have that, if that needs to be the role of art. I'm not sure. It is a good question, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you've raised a really
Thank
excellent question in response to it. Thank you so much, Anique. Barbara, were you going to share?
Sure. Um, I think art can be a salve to war as the artist can manage to create hard meaning, but also at the same time create beauty. So sort of like poetry. And I'd like to use an example of a work that I think is really successful in both of those areas. It's a triptych, a collaboration by Sandra Semchuk, Ukrainian Canadian, and her partner James Nicholas, who is a First Nations Canadian artist. And the work is a lush green photo triptych. And the photo is of the land with this text overlay. In the first panel is "You Don't Understand." The second panel, "Sharing is the Law." And the third panel, "The Land Owns Itself." This is so simple on the surface, and yet it contains in these words that could really come from a child, the whole problem, right up to, from First Nation atrocities right up to Putin's invasion of the Ukraine.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Barbara. It's not a piece that I knew before this moment, but I will absolutely be looking for that piece in order to spend some time with what you've shared and how you've positioned that work. I think it's really interesting because in my sort of both from a historical perspective, as a historian in a civic heritage context, and as a contemporary art curator, um, what I've recognized and what I've seen is that over the last 100 years, artists have both witnessed and also responded to both moments of personal war and conflict, but also moments of conflict that are happening outside of their immediate spaces, and that there seems to be a sort of um, a continuous return. And maybe that's the humanity. It's because at the center of it is our human selves, and trying to rationalize not only our relationships to what is happening around us, but how we are personally implicated in what we do day to day and how we live our lives, how we connect with others, how we connect with community. Um, I don't want to race ahead without inviting Anong to
Yeah,
offer some thoughts. Yeah.
I had an idea about this really that it's a really broad question, but something that I thought of is the fact that art is often used by groups of people, and that the art that you see at a given time really reflects different aspects of the conflict, and art that's shown in certain periods of time can reflect who the perceived winner of a conflict was.
Mm.
But that can be revisited later by other sides. I'm thinking back in World War II, you had suppressed art from people that were being dehumanized. So the first one of the steps in dehumanizing people is to negate the validity of their contemporary practice. And then later it went into having like documenta to try to restore balance to the artistic outputs. And even in Canada, we kind of see that with like the old Paul Kane and like, you know, images of Canada as being like terra nullius and empty and void and really move-inable. And now seeing more resurgence and in the 90s of Indigenous viewpoints on those things. So that's really one of the complexities of it, is that you become aware of the spirit of the times and how that isn't really how things will always be viewed. That as we go further in time and that people understand conflicts through looking back in history, they can see what viewpoints were suppressed and which were championed and for what reasons.
So interesting that you share that perspective, Anong, and I agree completely. What I learned when I looked at, and I'll use parentheses around the word canon, but the canon of war art in Canada um, was largely created and endorsed by white male perspectives. and Anglo perspective, frankly. And so this, in this project, although there is some historical acknowledgement of what those programs were and what they aspired to do, um, largely the work on display is actually from that other space that you've just described, which is, you know, individuals, first person account on the ground in spaces in the time of war, um, who by folks who probably wouldn't have defined themselves as artists or makers, but were using things like photography and other modes of expression to sort of, I think, not having the benefit of time travel and being able to talk to them personally, I think just to say that I am here, this is what's happening. I see this and I'm capturing it, I'm documenting it, I'm thinking about it. Um, and then we see other forms of creative expression where, right across time, where people are turning to sort of creative modes, making things with their hands, choosing interesting and diverse materials to work with, to trying to reach, I think, across that divide, right, between what is known or what is being endorsed or perpetuated as the main story of a particular place or time or event. Um, and through this work and from our contemporary lens, we can look at that work and say, but it's doing all of these other things. And it can't be divorced from their personal firsthand experience. Um, it sort of naturally leads me to my next question, which is, what does it mean to witness in art?
Mm.
Can't maybe can art witness, or through art can we witness?
To me, I think absolutely. I think the role of a witness is the role of an artist in so many ways. In a lot of African traditional practices and spiritual spaces, a witness is someone or group of people who are charged with the responsibility to remember and to reiterate what's happened. And in a sense, you're supposed to be able to say that this thing did not happen, that it occurred, and these are the ways in which it occurred. And it becomes part of, like, in many different more like spiritual practices, a really key part of that, to be able to say this happened, here's where it happened, and to constantly be telling that story on and on and on. And sometimes the stories get changed, or they become uh, mythologized in different ways, and yet you're still intended to continue sharing them. And for me, the retelling of those stories becomes the role of a storyteller or of a griot, and in the different ways that it gets interpreted through, visual spaces, through dance, through rhythms of the drum, um, through so many different ways that, to me, I mean, it's the art that becomes the container to hold those stories. Even just to me, when you think about a witness, as I said, it's not just to see it and to hold on to it for yourself. You must act on it. You must share it. You must remember it. You must offer it to others. So once that seeing becomes translated into something else, to me, you're assuming the role of the artist by sharing, by storytelling, by doing whatever it is that needs to be done with that. And so they're synonymous in so many ways.
That is so beautiful.
I was thinking the same, Barbara. Thank you so much, Anique. I love, and I wish I'd thought to include it in my question, your introduction of storytelling in that context. And when you said that word and you shared that perspective, I thought immediately those ideas between witness and story sort of stitched themselves together in my mind. And I feel that, that is that the agency, is that the power of art, to be able to create that communion, to experience and to people, frankly, and to ideas. And over time, because we are all in this current era, making the work we're making in from the places in which we live, from the communities in which we relate and connect, and carry those stories and that responsibility through our lives. And then when we're looking backward in time, as I think certainly the work in this exhibition does, and um, you know, what is the opportunity then to sort of witness from a distance? And what benefit then do we have in terms of sort of, maybe retelling that story? I'm thinking, Anong, of what you were sharing with us in answer to the last question, that retelling, that telling again and differently. I think there's incredible opportunity in that isn't separated or divorced from that seeing and witnessing that Anique was talking about.
Yeah, and I also think that it's that artists are able to take something out of the abstract and just the abstract historical, where it can be something mentioned as a fact, but to really humanize the details of
Mm.
what happened so that people are more able to relate to them. And I think that in a lot of conflict, there are those things about dehumanization, or, one side versus the other side. And it's really
Mm.
artists who are able to go through to the humanness of conflict and to share that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, the content, the concept of abstraction, and also sort of to make abstract experiences or unwieldy or irrational, maybe experiences, or irrational in the moment, because they defy logic, I think, when we're sort of in the experience. Um, and then the opportunity and the advantage of the artist then to also reincorporate abstraction or symbolism in their work in a way that sort of strategically reaches into a different kind of storytelling. And I'm thinking of this gathering of who we have together in this conversation. And Lynn, you not exclusively, but do in a major piece in this show use the tool of abstraction, I think, in order to reach across that space. I wondered if that occurred to you as well, as Anong was sharing.
Well, I'm thinking, I'm going back to the word witness, and it means to be there. And my very presence is a proof that my father died in this war. And so um, I I can say the war is real, you know.
Hmm.
I lost my father, and in losing my father, I lost everything, you know. And so um, it the fact that I exist makes me part of being, I am a witness to this. And so it's important that I tell my story because I'm here.
Absolutely. And I think it's so interesting too, to sort of broaden that out and say, um, you know, the impulse to say as humans, I am here, I see this, I think is part of, for me personally, thinking about sort of that agency, that space of agency that we have and that we hold, and that we're obliged to, and that we have a responsibility to care and to cultivate. I want to resurface that word you shared, Anique, in the context of caring, because I think also that is the place from which we see and and within which we are in our spaces, right? Um, I wondered now if I could turn to you, Barbara, and invite you to share a little bit more with us about the specific piece in this exhibition is called Small Security Blanket. It was made in 1990. It is not small; it is large. It's a large quilt appliqued with shapes, business suits, warplanes, bombs, and missiles, all cut from men's woolen suiting. The quilt considers the irony and the conflict between power and human values, and between social and political life, which I think is exactly sort of where our conversation was bringing us to. And so I wondered if you could share, Barbara, what moved you to produce the Security Blanket series?
Thank you. First, I'd like to say that when I'd worked on this body of work for about 5 or 6 years, and when a number of them were included in an exhibition, in Vancouver, it opened the same day as the first Gulf War was started. And so, many people said how timely this work was. And I was taken aback by that, and because I see it as something for all time. There's always a war. There's always power. There's always power over people, which is kind of what the suits represent. But the security blankets just snuck up on me. I sewed from when I was really young, sewed clothes. I turned to make a quilt after seeing an exhibition of old Ontario quilts, where I saw that quilts could mean something. I didn't grow up having quilts in my house. So I began this, the first security blanket with the intention of making a grid of applique suits. And as innocent and sort of folk art like as they were, they did speak of power. And the military imagery began to relieve the monotony of the repeated suits. But I realized right away that I had made the meaning. And then for the title, the security blanket title came as a gift from a friend. It was almost just a toss off. And that kind of set me on my way for a long time.
I'll say too, it was one of the first major bodies of work that I became really aware of in your practice. And so for me personally, I was excited about the work. It was, I felt at the time, doing something different, introducing a sort of quilting, handmade, um, it was made from a different place, I think, than a lot of the work that we were seeing in sort of contemporary gallery spaces at the time. And also for me, it has continued to be part of how I sort of interact and think about this body of work. And I'm so frankly delighted to be able to curate this particular wall hanging into the exhibition that that is the reason for our gathering today. But it is interesting to me because quilting, and actually this is coincidental, but I'm sitting in our textiles studio here at Guelph Museums, and the textiles behind me include quilts and other wall hangings that have been produced in and around Guelph for a very long time, and they fall into that other space, where quilting, and it is sort of a cross-cultural, timeless in many ways, way of capturing family story, of sharing and communing, of caring. I'm going to resurface that word again. Um, and I think that when we see the security blanket in the context of this exhibition, we've positioned it between the story of the First World War and the Second World War quite strategically because of the symbolism that it carries, and because, in fact, when we look at those time periods and the way that they're written about historically, our understandings of that time and place, understandings of the sort of systems at play, um, of that story, Anong, that you were talking about in terms of how it was written and documented and shared, and the propaganda, frankly, that supported the mission. Um, you know, that piece, in a way, speaks across that time frame, even though it isn't born of that space. That in fact it was the Gulf War um, in the 90s that sort of was happening in the context of that global conflict of the time, and to your own description, Barbara, not really centered in that space, but got co-opted into the narrative of that space. And so it's really interesting to me to hear you share that. It has a kind of simplicity in terms of its imagery, but an incredible weight in terms of how it carries across time and space, and what it does in this particular exhibition. I will say too that next to the wall hanging are embroidered greeting cards, which were handmade and part of the First World War narrative. which folks would trade and send to loved ones from distant places. And in fact, we have a collection of those cards here at the Guelph Civic Museum because people received them in Guelph, held onto them, carried them, and then donated them to the museum to be retained in the public archive here. So it is interesting to me how that sort of act of stitching and sewing and that demonstration of caring and communion across time and space really is shared in both pieces. Um, but perhaps from there, I'll turn to you, Anong, because your father, Carl Beam, created the Columbus Suite, a large series of photo etchings, also produced in 1990 or in and around 1990, so at the same time period as Barbara's Security Blanket series. And Carl Beam's work really, in this particular body of work, juxtaposed some of history's martyred, persecuted, and exiled figures. The print that we have from that series in the exhibition is called From Calvary to Cavalry. And I wanted to share sort of the distinction and definition of those two words because they are so similar in terms of how they're written and spoken, but mean very different things. So Calvary means an open air representation of the crucifixion of Jesus, but also an experience of intense mental suffering. And cavalry refers to soldiers who fought on horseback and also has a modern sort of soldiering meaning as well, but also is also a source of help or rescue in the case of an emergency. So the title of the piece, From Calvary to Cavalry, really struck me. This is a piece, this body of work that I had the great pleasure of curating some years ago. I think it was about 2014 at the Art Gallery of Guelph, then called McDonald Stewart Art Center, and really immediately thought about this piece in the context of witnessing war in the exhibition that is on view currently at Guelph Museums. And so really grateful to you, Anong, for joining us today to sort of help us to understand this particular body of work by your father. And so my question to you, I guess, is how did Carl Beam address unresolved cultural struggles through this particular group of works?
Okay, well, firstly, I'd like to introduce kind of how I come to speak for him in this way.
Please.
That he passed away early, and um, I've been studying and as his main studio helper for most of my life. I've just finished writing Carl Beam Life and Work for the Art Canada Institute. So I've also kind of studied him in situationally and his work. So it's one of those odd things where a child is also a student, is also being into the history of the person. My father, Carl Beam, started this series in 1990 as a getting ready as a response for 1992, which was the anniversary of Columbus's discovery of North America. So these works were all almost like a series of viewpoints on the aftermath, and they start with a turtle in the first image, and the turtle being a symbol of North America. There's writing that says, "Dear Columbus, the voyage was probably doomed from the start." And then it goes on to the other images. For my dad, so much of his work was about understanding how people could do things of these magnitudes to other human beings. He was a survivor of Garnier Residential School, and he was one of the first artists to reference residential school in his works. And this piece is one of those pieces really where the cultural difference of understanding, what side you're on. Even when you were introducing the work, you mentioned how it's also that the cavalry is a source of help or rescue in an emergency, but not for him or us in that viewpoint.
Yeah.
Calling in the cavalry is not a good thing in the Indigenous community. Kind of means things aren't great. And but in a Western sense, it's like here comes the rescue. So for him, it was thinking about how, with the play on words, how you could so simply go. How do you go from that to that? And the use of religion as as justification for calling in the cavalry and going in. And it was religion and Jesuits who ran the school that he went to. So they used the bringing in religion as a justification for some really awful experiences. And that's really what that was about. A lot of his work, he around this time, just shortly before he did these works, had traveled to Amsterdam and had visited Anne Frank's house. And around those times too, he had given me Anne Frank's diary, and he had collected many copies of it. And I think that his understanding also of the war. His father was a soldier who had died in a German POW camp, and he was really looking at how Anne Frank could something so personal could really help people understand the scale of what had happened. And he, after visiting her museum, he really brought a lot more of his personal experience at residential schools into his work, trying to help people understand. And at that time, they were not talked about at all. And I think it is, everyone can kind of see it's been quite a few years, 30 years since he did those works until just now kind of coming to these conversations. But
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you, Anong, so much for that, for sharing your personal, very personal reflections, Carl being your dad, and uh, and for positioning so eloquently you sort of all of the complex ways in which that piece both was created and reasons why it was created, and how it to your last point, some 30 years later, is really only coming into sort of a popular consciousness. um, the journey that we're on is a forever journey, frankly, into that knowing, and can, and how do we know, and can we know what that narrative is, in all the ways that are absolutely essential for us to move, to heal, to grow together, to acknowledge and not and change the history, change the story. And so for me, I think the opportunity of positioning this particular piece and holding space in this exhibition for Carl Beam's voice really stands in, it's a marked counterpoint to a lot of what is elsewise in the exhibition. I think most of the art on display is coming from, I would almost suggest, a peripheral space. What we don't see in the exhibition is any formal, um, you know, sort of the canon of war art in Canada. None of that material is on display in the exhibition. I talk about it because I needed, and I feel it's important to understand what that historical narrative is, because it's still out there, it's still being endorsed and talked about, but all of the art in the space is actually speaking from other places and imposing and shaping our understandings of that quote unquote canon, as I've been referring to it. So I think it's just so incredible how not just Carl's work, but all of the work in the show is actually pressing and pushing different boundaries in that awareness. And I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot, Lynn, because of course you have, in your personal background, you were part of you were a sister, a nun for 12 years, I understand. And so I wondered if you felt comfortable to share some thoughts in the context of the sort of the religious piece to not only Carl's work, but to the idea of healing, of even the act of war in the context, or the act of warring on people, even if it isn't sort of a quote unquote international sort of formal conflict, the wars that happen at home in our backyards, in our communities, that have done and continue to do so in our lives. Am I
Well,
putting you on the spot?
yes, but that's all right. um, I my own experience, being I was a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph in London, Ontario, and I have to say I did not see any of this. But I carry the burden knowing that I was a member of that congregation. And, I went in to serve God. And so to see, what the different orders and persons in these orders have done to children, it breaks my heart because that was not the purpose. And I feel so badly. And I also know that there are so many good people in those orders that are carrying this grief. And where I did not experience that, and please God, I did not give that out to the children and the young adults that I taught. But I just feel so badly because of this.
Well, I think we all share those feelings too, Lynn. And I didn't. My question wasn't intended to make to make you uncomfortable in any way, but I do think it. I think that discomfort, that the ability for us to talk with each other and be with each other and acknowledge um, those truths, both historically and present day, is so important and so valuable, not only to this kind of conversation, to, a thing that we call an exhibition, such as what was Witnessing War is, but how, frankly, in and around all of these moments, we have the ability to hold this space and to speak frankly and openly with one another, even when the discussion is uncomfortable. And I think this exhibition, in all of its sort of unquestionable beauty, because there is beauty and there is humanity in this narrative, is also full of tension and complexity and challenge. And I think that's the space, in fact, where we know one another as humans, and where we can actually, I hope, can come to a place where we can acknowledge and reflect and do the hard work to be together in a good way. Um, and I wonder if this isn't an opportunity for us to turn to your work, Anique. The piece in the exhibition that is on loan to us from the Art Gallery of Guelph, created by you in 2015, is part of a photographic series. The piece in particular is called Six Company Battalion, The Aunties, and it's a portrait of your mother and elder aunts wearing uniforms from the War of 1812. And so interested in this piece, this body of work, the idea of photography and performance, to ask questions about, I suggest, survival and resilience. I think it's also seated within care and caring and community and family. Um, but I'm really interested in the context of sort of a history lesson almost, how you use and how you counter history to talk about present day lived experiences. And is this particular photograph part of that work?
Um, this this series came about because I had learned a little bit more about my family history. Um, Essentially, that they were enslaved in the southern states, and then had to fight in the War of 1812, allied with the British Crown to receive to be able to essentially assert their freedom, and then were given land in Trinidad. So actual land. Titles, I guess. I'm not sure. I can't remember what it's called.
Hmm.
But the whole story is very. So to me, the story was just interesting for one because I hadn't. Growing up, I didn't even know the name of my grandparents. For example, like mom. Um, my mom was the youngest of 13, and um, in Caribbean households, you don't really know the names of people like who are older than you. You call them by their, auntie or papa or whatever. And so my mom she didn't know the name of her grandparents, and I didn't grow up knowing the name of mine really. And so, when we were in school and have to do like family tree exercises and all this stuff, like I could only go to my mom for the most part.
Yeah.
And so to learn about this deep, deep, deep history that dates back to before the War of 1812 was really interesting for me to put a certain sort of foundation into who I am in a sense. And then also just thinking about how complicated all those layers of that story is. Being enslaved, having to ally with the crown, then having land offered, and land that is like, you know, from in the Caribbean, in a place that those people would never have been before, whose land was it to begin with in the first place, like all these questions that are become fraught and entangled in this story. And so I wanted to think about that, and I wanted to think about it particularly on the through the lens of Black women and Black elder women in my life. And so at the time, that particular piece was done in response to Basquiat's work, actually, in thinking about a conversation that he was having in his paintings, looking at heroes and saints. And so I was thinking about it through that lens to think about what is a hero, what is a saint, how what is an ancestor, how do we memorialize and remember and complicate, and also think about the fantasy of history in that we never actually know. The stories are always changing, and those who get to write it are never the ones that who my family is part of. And so all those sort of pieces, I've always talked about that image as being an impossible image because though there were fighters, Black fighters in the War of 1812, they weren't given uniforms, and they were put at the very front of the line, so they would have been the first murdered. So, and you know, they weren't offered any proper like food supplies, all these things. And so and women wouldn't have been fighting either. So the men who received the land grabs or the land titles or whatever, and who were offered freedom would have to, if you weren't a partner to one of these men, you yourself could not have been freed under these conditions. And so I was thinking about all of those questions and all of that, and you know, share these stories that I had been learning um, through like research and asking questions with my mom and my family, my close, like my immediate family, and sort of just like having us tease through it. Like, wow, you know, some of these names my mom would have grown up hearing, sort of like as the old folks kind of thing, you know, and so. Yeah, it's just it became a space for me to untangle those stories and to still them for a moment so we can have a moment to sort of tease through and speak about them. um, yeah, and so the title comes from the Six Company Village, which is the village that my family initially would have settled in, and helped to clear. And each one of it's in the southern areas of Trinidad, and each one of the companies, so the military companies that would have fought in that war, were the villages that they grew up in or were placed in were named after the name of the company. So from, and I think some of them are skipped. So I think it's like third, fifth, and then maybe their second and sixth company. And you know, so all those things are sort of entangled with these colonial histories that are continuously being replayed, the colonial history of having to even fight for your freedom in this bizarre way, and then the questions around land, and then the questions around you know, like uh, ownership, possession of the body, of the land, of all these different things. So that's sort of how that series came about, a place to sort of rest all these questions and to tease them through.
Anique, you've planted so many really important thought pieces into my mind. I'll speak very personally. One of the phrases you used that I'm going to really think about carefully, and I think wanted to just bring up again is the fantasy of history. So interesting, and not a place from which I had been approaching our dialogue today, and I just sort of rings in my ear, and I think it's it's that coupled with how we know our family, how we know ourselves through our family relationships. Um, Also, the reality, the fact that you know war and conflict is, I think I think it's safe to say almost exclusively about land and occupation of land, and also about the people, whether they are expendable in that scenario or whether they are the ones sort of wielding wielding control of what that is. Um, and to me, you know, all three of those sort of threads of what you just shared, among so many other things, are really, really palpable in the work. I also it one of the reasons why I was interested in this piece in particular is also the sort of inversion of using strong female figures in your life, and also family as the place of power and priority in the context of the story that you're trying to tell with that work. um, I'm talking a lot, I know, but I want to hold space for other reflections from the group, if you have them.
Well, I was thinking, Anique, when you mentioned how we know ourselves, and I know I'm jumping forward with my story, but
Please, Lynn,
that
yes.
um, that has been my struggle as well, because in my case, my father was 21, and this is we're going back like 19. Well, anyways, we're going back sometime with World War II, but he had just finished high school, had done a little bit of university, and then he realized that if you wanted to, um, they're going to have to go to war, and he wanted to go into the Air Force, so he went early. But he married my mother while he was training, and then in 1942, he was shipped over to England for further training, and my mother was pregnant. And so he was in England, trained basically over at Middenhall, and he was training as a navigator, flying Wellington bombers and Anson planes. And on June 8th, my birthday, he was able to send my mother, cable my mother, a bouquet of long stem red roses. And so that was my mother's story to me of how he felt being so far away when I was born. And unfortunately, he died 3 months after that. So I never met him. And I never met his family either because he was an only child. And then my mother remarried, and Ed Westfall, who is I call my daddy, and they proceeded to have 10 children. So I am the only child of the first marriage and a very, very large second family, which I am grateful today. But it leaves an emptiness for me personally, because I don't know my father, and by the time I got my life together, meaning like by the time I got out of the convent and got stabilized in teaching and in doing my art and deciding I didn't want to have children, I'd rather do my art. It took a long time for me to really get on to looking at my father, and it was this book. I was in a library with my girlfriend who was raising her children French, and I thought, oh, what am I going to do here? But it was this book, Histoire de Babar, that I found in that library. And as I was turning the pages, I thought to myself, why do I know this book so well? So I wrote my mother a letter, and she said, Lynn, your father's family gave you a copy of it when you were 2. My father's family. I had done no research up to that point. And so that became my quest. And I just had a desire to search everywhere. And thankfully, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission uh, was able to find my father's name on the Runnymede War Memorial in England. And being a teacher, I went over with my husband on the March break, and this is what I did see while I was there. This is running me. This is, and in this memorial, there are 20,000 names of Commonwealth air persons who have no known grave. So when I saw all these names, just pillar by pillar by pillar, it just was absolutely overwhelming, the enormity of it. And so and then going back, then I'm storing all this information and feeling guilty that I haven't done a war piece. I should be doing a war piece, but
Mm.
nothing came to mind. I just was, and then 9/11 hit, and the date of my father's death is the eve of September 10th, 1942. So the eve of the 10th. Nobody knows what time his plane went down. All the plane and all the members in the plane were never found. And so when 9/11, it was the 11th of September. My dad died. It could have been the 11th, but all those many years later. So when I saw all those names in the newspapers, I thought, names, and I thought, now I've got it together. Now I know what to do. And so I did the painting that is in the exhibit is there, but this is the early stage of just names, eh? you know,
Mhm.
and Anique, when we're talking about lost graves, and names, names are just so important. And I remember when the painting was at this stage, and I remember going upstairs to my studio, and I saw this wall of names, and I thought, for every name, there is a family, and there may be children, and the enormity of that. I couldn't even touch the painting for about 3 months because it was just overwhelming. So, it has led then for me to go to Running Mead 3 or 4 times. And I've also gone to the Bomber Command Monument because my father was a navigator. And I remember being there in London, and that was since I've moved to Guelph. And I remember thinking, gee, I'm watching all these people, and it's a beautiful colossal statue with just like the men in their military garb. And I think, I'm I'm gonna be fine. And then I went up. I remember it was my turn to go up around, and I sort of grabbed the bottom of the foot of the navigator, and all of a sudden I just totally lost it. I totally lost it in the enormity of what I was doing. And so I also have been at that very same trip. I went to the Kosford Air Force Museum, and there they were repairing, and I knew this ahead of time, the second Wellington bomber that is in the world. And I got permission to actually go up inside that bomber and see the fabric of the bomber, to see the geodetic construction inside. My father sat here, he flew here, and you saw how thin the linen was, and they're flying so high up in the air, and no wonder they had big heavy jackets on. But the search continues like this. You know, how we know ourselves. It's just, for me, the military language is without a trace, and that is just such a horrible sentence, without a trace. Nobody knows what happened. We don't know whether his plane went down going over Germany at night or whether it was coming back. They don't know whether. We assume that the plane did not land on land. Must be in either the North Sea or the English Channel, but never found. So for me, it's an ongoing search. Yeah, an ongoing search.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Your just to leave us on that last phrase you used, the sort of actually remind us what it was.
Without a
Without a
trace.
trace, without a
Yeah,
trace.
yeah.
Very interesting. And I wonder if, in fact, that is partly to bring us to close our circle on today's conversation. If in fact what we're doing when we're using creative methods and ways of expressing and returning to and rewriting and sharing our from the places in which we live and work and create, if in fact what we're doing is tracing, and insisting actually that it has trace. There is evidence that we need to be aware and reach across that space in order to answer that question, to fill in that gap, um, to reach across that divide. Um, and would invite all of our listeners to the broadcast today. to visit the exhibition, to commune in person if you can with the works on display. There's so much more we could share in this conversation, but I think I'll leave it there because impossibly we're at the end of our time together for this moment. But I want to thank each and every one of you for your thoughts today, for your contributions, for the work you're doing, and for the voices you're extending in this project. And I'm grateful to you for the time we've shared today. Thank you so much.
It's
Thank
been a
you.
Thank
pleasure.
you all.
It's been great. Thank you.
And I'll just say too, thanks for all of our listeners. The exhibition called Witnessing War is on view at the Guelph Civic Museum until December 4th of this year. If you're interested in joining us again for June's History Bites, that will take place on the 15th of the month at noon, and it is centered on, it's called Where the Rivers Meet, which is, there are two main rivers that run through the middle of Guelph, and we're very interested in exploring sort of the intersection of those rivers and what it has meant for the people who have historically and today called Guelph home. Thank you so much, everyone. Be well and stay safe.